All right, we're going to get things started. Thanks again for joining us. Just a few housekeeping. As you join, we're just reminding you to introduce yourself in the chat. Feel free to share your name, pronouns, organizational affiliation, and where you're joining us from. The flow for today will be a 30 to 35-minute panel, which I'll moderate, and then we hope to have an engaging discussion for the remaining 15 minutes. Trans activists have been at the forefront of change and have helped to revolutionize the global LGBTIQ movement. In this session, we hear from trans and gender non-conforming activists and leaders as they reflect on the global movement, liberation, and our collective roles in advancing trans rights. My name is Nish McLean, Caribbean Program Officer at Outright Action International, and I'm based in Jamaica. I'm delighted to moderate this session, Forging Ahead, the past, present, and future of trans liberation globally, with my esteemed colleagues representing the global trans movement. I'll take a moment to introduce the panelists. We have with us Alexa Hoffman, who joins us from Barbados, where she is the chairperson of the board of the United Caribbean Trans Network, one of Outright's partners. Alexa is also the founding director of Trans Advocacy and Agitation Barbados. Great to have you, Alexa. We also have with us Liberty Mataisa, who is the executive director of Gender Dynamics and author of Love the Title, Our Darling's Journey to Liberty. Great to have you, Liberty. We have also Lua Stabile, a Brazilian queer trans feminist and human rights defender. Lua is also a 2019 Outright UN Religion Fellow. Lua, pleasure to have you with us. And last but certainly not least, we have Mukasa. Mukasa is the program officer with the International Trans Fund, where he oversees grant making and provides support to trans groups through outreach, advice, communication, and capacity building. I'm very pleased to open this panel and join you here today. To start with, I'd like to open the panel with a poem that I wrote. And I wrote this about 2 years ago in honor of Trans Awareness Month. And this, I hope, will help to ground us in the conversation that we hope to have today. So if you allow me, please. They may try to erase us or deny our very existence. But our resilience runs hot like lava, marked by the blood of those who paved the way, on whose shoulders we stand, legends whose names echo in our hearts. A silent rhythm resonating as armor, pooling, simmering, pulsating, our bodies a battle cry, rising from the ashes of the lost. We shall not fade into the shadows, neither will we break on the tide of their disdain. We cannot wait for liberation. The stolen lives of our siblings require our action. We pave the path for the next generation, invigorated, celebrated, liberated. And with that, I'd like to ask our panelists to share with us their reflection on the struggle, successes, and resiliency of the global trans movement. What do you see as some of the pivotal moments of the past 10 years, and also the hope for the next 10 years? Alexa, we'll open with you to give your reflection on the past 10 years.
Okay. Well, thinking back on the last 10 years, I'm going to have to start a little closer to the present. So, for example, the 2018 ruling, which deemed a law in Guyana which criminalized what they called cross-dressing for an inappropriate purpose as being unconstitutional. That's something that's pivotal for trans people in Guyana. And it also helps to set a precedent for trans people in other parts of the Caribbean who would also acknowledge the CCJ's jurisdiction. Then there's also the advisory opinion of the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, OC 24/17, where it was determined that states parties, various governments that acknowledge the IACHR should make efforts to allow for trans people to be able to update their documentation, that it reflects their sexual and gender identity and expression. And there are also a number of movements that have taken place in various territories throughout the region. For example, in fact, no, I can't use that I'll use it as an example, even though it was ultimately withdrawn. There was the effort made in Belize to have an equal opportunities bill, which prohibited discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And there are many other situations like that that have taken place within the last 10 years where trans people are becoming more and more recognized in the eyes of the law, because it's one thing to be recognized socially, but also to be recognized legally, because that can tip into what it means for the future. Where should our human rights ever be violated for any reason by any individual, whether it's a private citizen or an agent of the state, because we are acknowledged as trans people under the law and we are given that affirmation under the law, we have a means to be made whole again should anything go wrong. So that's what I see in terms of the pivotal moments within the last 10 years, being able to acknowledge that, you know, who we are is not the result of mental disease or disorder, that, you know, we do have human rights and just like anyone else, and they should be protected, and that our mere existence and our mere visibility should not be seen as an offense against the law.
Much for that reflection, Alexa. And what you have displayed, and as you speak about the Caribbean context, is that there are a number of countries in the region who, through law and policy, there are efforts led many times by trans people to ensure that the rights of trans people are recognized, as you said, not just socially, but also legally. Liberty, would you like to jump in here and speak to us about what the past 10 years, what are some of those pivotal moments in your context over the past 10 years? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Nish, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Liberty. Can you hear us?
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Been hearing you.
Hello?
One moment, Liberty. I think you are now on mute, but we were hearing you clearly. Go ahead.
Hello?
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 We'll try to get that sorted.
No, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Hear
Sorry.
you.
Sorry.
Okay, I can't seem to hear the others.
Sorry, my audio is very, very bad. I don't know what's happening.
All right, we'll come back to you, Liberty, and see what's happening. Perhaps we may ask Loa, if you can hear us, to jump in and
Yes.
talk a little bit about the future. I'm sorry about
Okay.
that, Liberty.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I jumped into Liberty, right?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Am I supposed to speak now, or should I wait for Liberty to finish?
Lua, can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Am I supposed to speak now, or am I supposed to wait?
Lua, it's Liberty.
All right, so here's
It's
what we
Liberty speaking.
I think we have a little bit of technical issue. So Loa, if it's okay, if you can let Liberty know that she can go ahead and give her intervention.
Okay, so you can go ahead, Liberty. Sorry.
Nish, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Okay, so I think for to start off, just an acknowledgement around some of the damage that has already been done by medical science and how trans identities have been shaped, and particularly within a pathologizing way within the world in which we live. Secondly, the role that culture has played in marginalizing trans and gender diverse persons alongside LGBTI communities more broadly, as being un-African. And then, of course, the role of religion in depicting us as sinful and immoral for embodying our identities and living our identities the way we do within the world. And so in looking at some of the ways in which we've been trying to push back within the African context in particular, in 2014, a regional stance was taken by the African Commission after many, many years of advocacy work. And this was in the context of Resolution 275, that of course takes a stance against violence against LGBTI communities more broadly on the African continent. And this particular instrument is aligned, or document is aligned to the African Charter that does speak to principles of non-discrimination, equality before the law, issues around dignity, and of course, freedom from cruel and inhumane treatment. So this was a huge victory for the LGBTI community. And that is, of course, also aligned to the Maputo Protocol, which then promotes, advances the stances of women on the continent and advocating against violence against women, regardless of sexual orientation and gender identity. I think a second pivotal moment for us has been the fact that post-2015, where the Southern Africa Trans Forum has been loosely established, was that we've seen a slow but a rapid increase of trans-led and trans-specific organizations across the region. So we went from about 5 in 2015 to about 80 now, and this number is ever growing, which means that there's in-country presence of trans-led and trans-specific organizations. We've also seen a wave of decriminalization to some extent across the country. This speaks specifically to the issue of decriminalizing same-sex consensual sexual conduct, oftentimes done then through legislative means. We've seen increased momentum towards legal gender recognition, and this has been predominantly through judicial routes being undertaken. One example of this has been the ND case in Botswana, through which transgender persons are able to get legal gender marker changes. However, again, it wasn't a legislative decision, it was a judicial decision that led to this particular shift in the law. In South Africa, we've seen a shift last year in 2019, where the Western Cape High Court then held that a transgender person that's incarcerated for all intents and purposes must be recognized for the gender that they affirm within these particular spaces. And we've been able to obtain a court order that says that a transgender woman cannot be discriminated against within prison systems on the basis of a gender identity. And so people are able to freely wear the minimal jewelry, minimal makeup, and then of course being addressed by the correct pronouns within these particular spaces. At the moment, we do see that there's a lot of mobilization towards shifting the current legal pathologization models upon which legal gender recognition laws are based, and that we've seen globally. On the 20th of November this year, we launched a position paper on legal gender recognition law in South Africa, which seeks to do the same. And I think that then ties into this global discourse around shaping trans belonging and citizenship within the context of a human rights-based model that's premised on gender self-determination. And then, of course, one of the critical or strategic decisions that have been taken by the World Health Organization that underpins this work within a domestic context for us is really the depathologization of trans identities in the International Classification of Diseases 11, which is not necessarily being rolled out as yet, but we do look to this particular document and victory as it stands for guidance on what becomes possible within the legal context.
Very much, Liberty. I think you gave a great analysis of where we are, where the last 10 years have taken us, particularly as we move away from depathologization and moving towards, as you said, trans citizenship in the framing of a human rights model. So I think this is an appropriate time to turn over to Loa to speak about the things that we have done in the last 10 years to build our movement.
Hello?
Where are we in the next 10 years?
Hello,
You
everyone.
were?
Hi. I'm so sorry. I jumped into your speech. I do you hear me? Is
I
everyone
can hear,
Yes.
I can hear you.
okay? So I want to apologize because I am using my cell phone and I don't have a computer here available right now, and I'm having some struggles with the audio. But if everyone is listening to me, I think yes, we had some huge successes in the last 10 years. In the last years, I think the trans movement has improved a lot, and also the visibility. And I think this year was a very strange year, and we are living through this pandemic which has many socioeconomic impacts, not just in the health of the trans people, but also in the way they in the way we have access to jobs or to the labor market or to any income. And we are seeing that sex work is increasing again as an opportunity to have an income because of the jobs that many people are losing. And of course, mental health is something that is it's a huge concern right now. And I think this will be what we as trans people and we as trans movement will have to bear in mind for the next for the future and for the next 10 years. I think we need to think of new strategies of how to deal with the social medias, with this technology that we need to be very close with this pandemic, and also how to strategize through these networks online. And but also what I'm seeing here in Brazil, especially in the last months, in the end of this year, with the new election we had, and a lot of new trans persons had been elected for many cities through local elections and for council houses, and the first trans man was elected, and we had the most elected person was a trans woman in Brazil, and the second one was also a trans woman. So we broke all the rules here in Brazil in this last elections. And I'm seeing really this resilience and this hope that we are bringing to the table, that we are bringing that we know how to survive these difficulties. We know how to overcome these episodes of like this pandemic we are living. We are very experienced in how to overcome these issues and how to survive and how to isolate, for example, because we always been very isolated from society or from family or from friends, and we can teach the world how to build hope and resilience, even going through a lot of discrimination and oppression.
Thank you, Loa. So many great gems that you shared there. Indeed, you know, as trans people, we have been surviving difficulties throughout most of our lives, and our resiliency has been put to the test many times. So thank you for sharing that. Mukasa, could you close out this question for us and tell us, in your perspective, as you reflect on the next 10 years, what do you see? What is your desire and hope?
Yes, hello. So the ITF is a participatory grant-making fund comprised of trans activists and donors. We are the only global participatory grant maker that is exclusively dedicated to supporting trans-led groups to secure rights for trans people and improve the lived realities of trans individuals. I think I would really speak for a lot of people when I say that our biggest hope is that we will see an increase in funding flowing directly to trans-led grassroots groups. These are the groups doing the work on the front lines. We need to see an increase in the number of funders who fund trans-led groups and the amount that they fund. I also wanted to cross-sectoral solidarity with the increasing rise of anti-gender ideology and tough attacks. We urgently need to build connections and solidarity with other movements, particularly with feminist and women's rights organizations, sex workers organizations, groups working on racial justice, indigenous rights. Progress and real positive change is only possible when we are working together and with an intersectional approach and analysis. My big hope is that we can build cross-sectoral solidarity that is intentional and authentic. This is how we can respond to attacks, build communities, and celebrate successes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mukasa. I think that gives us a great segue into our next question, because what we need in this moment as a global trans movement is solidarity. It is more resources as well. We need to be able to support our communities as best as possible. And solidarity and building connections is key to that process. And so as we reflect on the global movement and what you all have identified are some of the challenges that our community has been facing, such as unemployment, violence, and as well as homelessness. And we have also identified that there's also an increase in visibility and activism happening globally. So can we talk about what liberation means for our community from your personal and professional perspective? Lua, we'll go ahead and start with you, please.
Yes, I think this year what made us survive and continue fighting, I think, was music and art and culture, and I think this will be very necessary to continue our fight, our global fight as towards the trans liberation. And I think we need to see how this growth of artists and people who are building art and building culture during this year, and how difficult it is to find this resilience to build this kind of culture. And here in Brazil, we have many new artists that are really having a lot of success in the mainstream media, and it's what makes it is what also shows some contradictory views on Brazil, on how we are very diverse and how we have many artists and many trans artists in the mainstream media right now, and we also have an increase of violence and towards trans people in the streets, even during a pandemic, when we thought that this would decrease, and we and then main trans networks showed last month how this was the year that we had more losses on trans lives here in Brazil, and also the increase of suicide and mental health issues in these kind of losses as well. So I think art and culture will be essential, and we need to look at our trans artists and trans people who are within this environment, because they support us resist and continue the fight.
I agree with you. I think the arts and culture and the creative industry as a whole has been a source of healing and resistance for our community in a time when we most need them. So thank you for sharing that reflection. I'll go over to Mukasa, and then Liberty will jump in right after Mukasa shares your perspective on liberation for our community.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Nish. Trans groups are doing amazing work. And I particularly want to recognize right now the trans groups representing the realities of the most marginalized trans persons, including trans people of color, trans refugees, trans elder persons, trans persons living in vulnerable areas. I suppose liberation means trans persons having unrestricted access to gender-affirming healthcare, for starters. That includes the availability of hormones and surgeries at no cost to them. Trans persons really need to have better livelihood as well to thrive, having safe and decent housing, having food. Laura just talked about the devastating effects of COVID-19 and what it has done to the world, trans persons being the most marginalized as well. It's most important for folks to make a commitment to uplift the most marginalized. And again, I'll repeat, a recognition of the intersectionalities that exist in the trans communities. The ITF's work is motivated by imagining a world where all trans people are safe, free, and can live with dignity and respect. Where we uplift and celebrate our diverse communities, unstoppable creativity.
So if you can hear us, we might have lost you.
Hello, can you hear me?
I was able to hear Mukasa the entire.
Oh, hello.
Hi, I can
sorry.
hear you, Mukasa. I'm not sure about Nish.
I hear you as well, Mukasa.
Okay, that's great. No, I was actually just wrapping up around liberation, and I also want to say that these are all areas that's a work in progress across all movements, and coming together, uniting with solidarity is very important for us. Thank you.
So I think to perhaps speak from where you left off now, Mukasa, that liberation for us on this end of the world also means visibility and inclusion. And Lua spoke about some trans and gender diverse persons that have entered politics and have subsequently been successful in taking up space within government, within the legislature. And I think that for us is really also a goal that we are working towards, in ensuring that We can live in a society where we can be who we are openly and freely without the fear of stigma, discrimination, and violence, and be able to take up space within the different spheres of government, whether it be the administration, the executive, legislature, or the judiciary. I'm reminded of a young gender non-conforming person that was recently admitted to the Bar Association of South Africa to be able to practice as an advocate of the High Court or the superior courts in the country. And the person went in there with a trans flag mask on, with rainbow stockings, wearing traditional black and white clothing, but the bottoms with a skirt with all of the names of people that were sacrificed within the struggle for LGBTI liberation within the country. And that in itself is powerful in the sense that it speaks to liberation. It speaks to more possibility being opened up in a very rigid and very conservative and oppressive space for more people, more trans and gender diverse persons to be able to enter in without having to hide who we are. In addition to that, I think in South Africa, we've seen that our country looks very good on paper when it comes to rights accruing to trans and gender diverse persons. We've got a law called the Alteration of Sex Description and Sex Status Act, 49 of 2003, that is the legal mechanism through which a transgender person can change the legal particulars, the gender marker within the country, though in a very pathologizing model still. So that mechanism exists as a mode to take us to somewhat of liberation. But if we look at the lived realities of our people, it stands in stark contrast to that law and to the Constitution that prohibits discrimination on the grounds of gender and sexual orientation. So if we're looking at how we can claim socioeconomic rights, it still remains a hardship. And the bigger question that we have for ourselves is, how do we engage the issue of access when we already know that our country is marred by issues of poverty? Majority of the country is living in the uttermost dire states. And of course, wealth and income inequality still persists and is ever growing by the day, sitting with high rates of unemployment. And of course, these elements, these issues provides the backdrop for which violence and particularly gender-based oppression can manifest itself. So last year at Out Summit, I asked the question in terms of, when we speak about liberation, we also find ourselves as trans and gender diverse persons in this context locked in with liberation struggles with people who are not trans identifying and gender diverse identifying. And so there's this particular solidarity that needs to be established in order for us to be able to move forward together while simultaneously transferring knowledge, understanding and experiences of our lived realities and why that needs to become politically relevant within these bigger, broader, overarching socioeconomic agendas that's being shaped. So how do we advocate for gender affirming healthcare at the primary health level by taking services to the people as opposed to the people coming to service rendering points within urban centers, if we cannot even have a conversation about what does it mean to get access to comprehensive health care for people in general in a dignified manner within the South African context? If we are looking at access to housing, how do we advance issues for access to low-cost housing and inclusive temporary shelters for trans and gender diverse persons when the majority of our people don't even have access to dignified housing or living arrangements? How do we advocate for gender-neutral toilets when the majority of our people don't even have access to basic sanitation? So our issue, our liberation struggle in essence, is very much intertwined with broader overarching struggles for dignity of the general population. And I think for us, we find value at this time in seeing the need to be able to participate within those particular spaces so that we can all move forward collectively and find pride in that solidarity.
Thank you, Liberty. I'm going to ask Alexa to wrap us up with this particular question. And I think this question that Susan has in the chat, how do we achieve global trans solidarity? As we get to that question eventually, this is pretty much what Liberty is talking about in terms of how do we achieve advance our movement when we have to consider the backdrop of oppression that our community exists in and is experiencing, and the social issues that frame that backdrop. So Alexa, if you could talk to us about this question, what is liberation for you in your context, in the Caribbean context, and we'll move forward into our final question before Q&A. So please start sharing your questions in the chat. We are happy to take some questions. We'll allow for about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions. Alexa, over to you.
Yes, well, to begin with, I always understand that, I may do as an advocate, whatever work that I advocate would undertake, there's always that looming premise of intersectionality. So none of our work can exist on its own. It can't exist in a vacuum. There's always something that's inextricably linked with it. So, whether it is gender-based violence, whether it is employment rights, whether it is, universal health care, whether it is, justice reform, there's always something that we're doing that's going to tap into one of those other areas. And latching on to what Liberty mentioned, how can we push and advance the cause of being able to prevent ourselves from being discriminated against when we have, situations, for example, right now in Barbados, we're having a lot of industrial protests as an entire security firm that, they've been out there with placards and everything because they haven't received a raise in over 10 years and there are issues with renegotiations of contracts. We've had another place that I don't know what happened to them, but they basically had to lay off all of their staff. And the people, when they went to collect their paperwork for Social Security, showed up to lock gates and they couldn't get in to get the paperwork. We've got another hotel where, well, at least two hotels where people are being laid off and there's no way for them to receive their severance. They're saying, oh, go to the Social Security office, when really it's the employer's job to fulfill that. So now when you come into the realm of employment discrimination against trans people, those are also issues that I would have to consider, that any other trans or LGBTI advocate has to consider. First we need to, it's basically, before you start to embroider this dress, you have to iron it first. You have to make sure that it's clean, it's properly pressed, the fabric is in good condition, because otherwise you try to put on the embroidery and it may rip even more, or the embroidery will just fall right off. So that's definitely something that you have to look at, the intersectionality and what role can you play as a trans advocate in these various aspects, because like I said, none of them exist in a vacuum of their own. So, you're talking about gender-based violence. You also got to, amplify the voice of trans people who may be subject to intimate partner violence. You're looking at employee relations. You also got to look at discrimination of trans people. You want to deal with criminal reform, criminal justice reform. You also got to look at disproportionate sentencing handed down to trans people. So that's definitely something that has to be looked at. And then, of course, in building the solidarity, in doing the intersectionality, networking with those other organizations whose primary focus are the issues that we also have to look at. It helps to network with them, because then it allows for some sort of a bolster that when it's our turn now to speak on the issues, there are these other organizations that can say, well, yes, because we were made of these situations and it has caused us in turn to look a little bit outside of what we're doing, and we've been able to get a look into, the experiences of trans people, the experience of intersex people, gender non-conforming people.
So much, Alexa. Much appreciated. And I think that really helps us to approach the final question before we open up for Q&A. And what we're looking at this time is that we know that solidarity is important. Our global movement requires that we support, as Liberty says, our issues. Also, we have to consider the issues that we have within our community as it links to the wider population as well, because we exist in the very same context that we advocate for. So as we think about that, how can governments, human rights defenders, and donors support the global movement? In order to give our persons who are listening some time to ask questions and respond. Questions are coming in. If you could just answer in about maybe a minute. So for each of you, starting with Mukasa, what is the role of donors? How can donors support the global trans movement? You spoke a little bit about it before, but could you give us a little bit more on that?
Sure. So in the short amount of time, as we all know, trans-led groups are massively underfunded, working on shoestring budgets and facing high levels of burnout and trauma. I think it's worth taking a minute to acknowledge the incredible work that is being done, often with virtually no funding. At the ITF, we strongly believe that donors need to ensure that funding is actually reaching trans-led organizations. There's the urgent need to fund trans-led groups and trans leadership. The long-standing adage of nothing about us without us is one that I think we need to invoke here. As the global trans movement faces widespread violence and discrimination, right-wing attacks and backlash, and shrinking civil society spaces, it is absolutely crucial that resources that are earmarked for work to promote trans rights should be flowing to organizations that have trans people in leadership and decision-making roles. They are the ones with the solutions, and we should be amplifying and supporting their work. Lastly, we also need to increase the overall amount of funding earmarked for trans communities and movements across the globe. In the 2017-2018 Global Resources Report, they found that funding that focused on trans communities represented just 11% of all funding for LGBTI issues. This means trans communities are fighting over funding scraps. I'll leave it at that.
Such a short, not enough time to answer such a very deep and important question, but thank you very much for what you were able to share, Mukasa. So we'll go over to Lua, who will talk about what human rights defenders can do to support the trans movement. Thank you, Lua.
Yeah, I think human rights defenders have a huge responsibility towards trans liberation and towards protection of trans rights, because we need to bring the issue of trans rights and issue of trans liberation into the human rights agenda, into the human rights issues, into all the role of human rights issues. And I think the first thing that they can support is to first recognize this movement, recognize the importance, recognize the history of the movement, recognize all the struggles that we face, and also prioritizing our issues into the role of human rights issues is also very important to have this priority, even within a lot of others priorities to be also a priority. And I totally agree with Liberty and Mokasa, and also with Alexa. We need human rights defenders need to have an intersectional lens towards trans issues, and we need to understand that trans people have other issues that are crossed with the trans issues. For example, the issue of race and racism, and also the issues of class, of access to housing, to food, to medicines, to proper and qualified healthcare, and all of these issues needs to be intersect with the trans issue. In all statements, all projects, all actions and activities dedicated towards human rights and dedicated, for example, to housing, to these basic issues of human rights, always have this intersection of how this is how this is dealt by the trans community. So I think it's always important to call trans movements, make partnerships with trans persons and trans movements and organizations, and make these people visible, and also hire trans persons to work with you in your organizations, in your human rights organizations and institutions. It's always important to have the lens of trans people in our organizations, because this bring light to the issue in a different way. But also it's very important that the support of cis allies. So I think always it's important to be there for the trans people, and listening to their struggles. It's always a first step.
Thanks, Loa. All right, so with that being said, I think that also gives us a good segue for Alexa's response, who, Alexa, you'll talk a bit about government's responsibility. And of course, we know that in responding, can talk a bit about the government's role in ensuring that they reflect on our issues in an intersectional way and be able to respond to the needs of our trans community. So in about a minute, Alexa, can you say, what do you think, how can government support the global trans movement?
I would start by first saying government. Remember that first and foremost, not only are we trans people, but we're also citizens of the countries which they have jurisdiction over. So, as I always like to say, the same way how they will demand that we must pay our share of taxes, the same way how they will demand that we must, play our role in pulling the country forward from strength to strength, they also need to return the favor. So when it comes to ensuring that, we have a justice system that treats us fairly, we have, a healthcare system that meets our needs adequately, that we are properly accounted for. As I said from the very beginning, don't just acknowledge us socially, acknowledge us legally, acknowledge us in every other facet of life within the general population. Also, I realize that there's this trend where a lot of our governments will go into international forums like the UN and the OAS and whatnot, and they will sign on to and ratify treaties that, as time goes along, the treaties are understood to also protect LGBTI people, but they conveniently don't remember to, adhere to those provisions as they relate to us. They may wish to do everything else and then stop miserably short when it comes to dealing not just with, LGBT people, but trans people as well. And, that's the other thing that I would also mention. Take the human rights of trans people seriously, the same way how, for example, our government puts provisions differently able. They put provisions in place, to deal with elder abuse. They put provisions in place to prevent child abuse. They put provisions in place to try to prevent employer exploitation of employees. Also put provisions in place to prevent LGBTI people from being criminalized, to prevent trans people from being thrown under the bus when it comes to situations that can put us in danger, whether it's with regard to our safety, or our life, our safety or our livelihood. And also just ultimately take the time to listen to us, take the time to sit with us, the same way how when, politicians are looking to get elected for certain constituencies, they want to become MPs and they're going to go door to door canvassing for votes. Take that time in between elections to also go from community to community, from organization to organization, to meet with us, to sit with us, to listen to us, and to take notes, take very careful, diligent notes on what is needed. And then based on what we have told you, based on where things are at, formulate a plan of action and execute it to fill the gaps where they are.
will jump in and close out this particular section for us. Thank you, Alexa. That was really well said.
It feels a bit like I'm in another dimension here, communicating on multiple platforms. Thank you for that overview, Alexa, and definitely concurring with you around the major issues that you've raised around us paying taxes, and of course, subsequently, that we do have entitlements to how we want to be governed and the types of services that we ought to have access to as trans and gender diverse persons. I think one of the things for me that stands out is the fact that at a political level, our heads of states need to become a bit more serious about human rights issues, just in general. And secondly, be able to acknowledge the existence of trans and gender diverse persons, and broadly speaking, LGBTI communities. And when doing so affirmatively. South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has mentioned trans and gender diverse persons within his State of the Nation addresses, and that has gone a long way in shaping social discourse around how we are engaged with by broader society. I think there's also a need to look at supporting the efforts of passing laws that affirmatively recognize trans and gender diverse persons outside of a pathologization model. And of course, in the same sense, also being able to take gender affirming healthcare to the people, and specifically within rural contexts and peri-urban contexts. These are the communities that are generally left behind, even if we do make gains for trans and gender diverse persons, as a lot of those gains are then situated within your bigger urban centers. Another issue would be for government to create official platforms where government and civil society can meet to dialogue and engage around issues concerning the community. In South Africa, we've developed a national task team that's supported by provincial task team, through which issues concerning violence, the expedition of issues with the criminal justice system gets dealt with, and these are particularly relate to issues concerning hate crimes and violence against LGBTI communities more broadly. And then, of course, if we're looking at it at a regional level and at the international level, progressive states should be taking regressive states, within inverted commas, to task on the issues of how they are neglecting human rights realizations. So how does a South Africa within an African context display loudmouth diplomacy in order to hold another state accountable for how it is oppressing and, of course, violating the human rights of trans and gender diverse persons? We need to conceptualize laws and policies beyond the typical gender binary to incorporate the true depths of experiences of trans and gender diverse persons. That understanding needs to be integrated within domestic gender machinery in order to drive a change through programming. And of course, our governments, when committed, needs to make concerted efforts in being able to track and monitor the commitments they are making within getting trans people from margin to center.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, panelists. I think we could use 2-3 hours if we could have the opportunity to continue this conversation. I really want to give to give us a chance to answer the questions. We have about 3 questions that were asked. So what I'll do, I'll read them out, and I'm just going to ask each person to choose one question that speaks mostly to you, and if you could respond to that question. So Susan asked, how can we achieve global solidarity? We had a question from Quinn. How do we work towards better access to healthcare for trans individuals when doctors and healthcare workers can deny service without opposition? And Nick asks, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly. Nick asks, trans youth are more likely to experience houselessness and homelessness. What are some of the trans housing options that folks without shelter can access in your area of the world? Let's start with Loa. If you could give a wonderful intervention on one of these questions in a minute, please.
Yeah, thank you. I think global solidarity, I think I will say this again, but I think it's important because I think intersectionality needs to be on the center to achieve global solidarity. We won't achieve global solidarity if we don't understand that trans issues are not unique in every country, are not the same in every part of the world, but we are in every part of the world. So we have to have this global solidarity, but also acknowledging that we are diverse and that we have different cultures, different identities, different races, we are perceived differently in every country, in every region. So and the most important is to understand that this creates different ways to survive, different ways to be resilient, different ways to achieve some kind of basic rights or basic income or basic access. So I think intersectionality it must be at the center.
Thank you, Loa. Alexa, would you like to jump in here? All right. In the interest of time, perhaps Mukasa, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, just to emphasize what Lua has spoken to, I'll take that same question. I think really for global solidarity to happen, the first thing is having an intersectionality. So maybe how about asking what your approach is in your principles, but also in your practice, that the most marginalized communities are not only involved, but are speaking about their experiences themselves and empowered. And I also mentioned something around cross-sectoral solidarity. I think it's really important to work with feminist and women rights organizations and the other marginalized communities that are building these powerful platforms for change.
All right, thank you. Indeed, like absolutely well said.
In terms of addressing the issue concerning how do we work towards better access to healthcare for trans people when doctors can, of course, deny services without opposition, I think that for us, there's a huge emphasis on holding healthcare providers accountable to the oath that they take in being able to serve everyone equally within the profession that they've committed themselves to. In addition to that, if that, of course, fails, we do invest time in being able to engage different stakeholders, whether it is the Department of Health, whether it is NGOs located across the region who have strong relationships with medical professionals, to bring them on board to be trained, sensitized around how to render care to trans and gender diverse persons in breaching the divide that typically exists. And that divide is the stigma, the discrimination that is able to exist because people many times don't understand or want to understand how we are situated and where we are situated within society. So once people step into those trainings, they get a different perspective. And at times, there is a change in how they see their role within the context of rendering care. So I think that is an approach that we have undertaken as an organization to try and move people towards a space of wanting to undertake and commit themselves to trans-affirming care. At the same time, being able to advocate and subsequently for healthcare to include trans-affirming care is of critical importance, because we know that our government here in South Africa is not going to give us something just when we ask for it. We have to fight for it, and that is unfortunate. But as an organization, we have committed ourselves to that unfortunate battle that we have to fight at this time, and hopefully that can set precedent in how we can look at trans-affirming care within within the South African and, of course, broadly speaking, Southern Africa context.
Thank you so much, Liberty. Thank you, Alexa. Thank you, Loa, and thank you, Makala, for joining us for this riveting conversation. And I will close by saying that it is indeed a battle, and our liberation means everything to us as a community, and it honors our resiliency as well. We exist. We are in every part of the world, and we aren't going anywhere. So thank you so much for joining us and standing in solidarity with our global trans movement, and we look forward to your support. So thank you everybody for joining us for this session at Out Summit. We look forward to seeing you again virtually or in person. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.